What is the VolunteerMatch Network? Imagine a world of volunteers looking for their perfect match.
When a nonprofit posts a volunteer opportunity on VolunteerMatch, that opportunity has the potential to reach millions of interested volunteers. To illustrate the reach of our network, let's imagine that this piece of candy represents 10,000 people.
An average of 15 million people visit volunteermatch.org each year. In addition, each volunteer opportunity has the potential to reach 10 million pro bono and skilled volunteers through LinkedIn's volunteer marketplace. 2.6 million employee volunteers search for our opportunities from companies like Starbucks, Groupon, and JetBlue. And more than 500,000 employee volunteers from multiple corporate giving platforms have access to volunteer opportunities from our network. Since 1998, VolunteerMatch has facilitated over 12 million nonprofit volunteer connections. Now that you know more about the reach of our network, get started by going to volunteermatch.org and posting your volunteer opportunity today.
I'm Jane Evans, and I have worked for 24 years with children, young people and adults who've experienced trauma, and they've been my greatest teachers. So what do we actually even mean by trauma? What I find is that many people, when I use the word, they think that they know what it is, but actually it has a much broader meaning than perhaps we're widely familiar with as a society and as individuals and professionals. So trauma is commonly defined as anything which a child, a young person or an adult finds overwhelming. It completely overwhelms their senses, their emotional state, their physical state, and that becomes traumatic if it's ongoing. So for example, somebody could jump through the door now and I would definitely be scared and jump and have a big shock. But once I realized, it's just my son playing around or something, then I would calm again and feel more relaxed, and eventually my heartbeat would slow down. So it would just be a momentary thing that would not be traumatic. If repeatedly somebody kept bursting through my door here and running in the room and smacking me around the head or threatening to smack me around the head or yelling at me, and that was just ongoing, then my whole system would stay in this state of tension all the time. When are they coming? Are they coming? Was that? Did I hear them? So that's when, if I lived like that every day, which of course many children, young people and adults do, particularly when we think of domestic violence and other abusive situations, that's traumatic because there isn't a chance to come down and go back to a resting rate emotionally and physically, and it's just too much for our systems. So particularly if we think of children, a developing baby who can make no sense of any of this at all, can't escape, can't put any of it into words, can't fight the scary person, what is going to happen with them is the more frightened they become, the more they will go into a state of frozen watchfulness. And there won't be any reaction, we won't see anything, but the memory of everything that they're living through becomes stored throughout their being. So we all store trauma actually in our bodies as much, if not more, than our brains. And that's very, very significant in terms of understanding our own journeys, the children's journeys, and the work that we are doing as practitioners. Because many of the solutions which are offered are very much around talking and using our brains to kind of cope with trauma. But where the trauma world is now is that we really need to engage with the body, which I will talk more about. So it's the ongoing nature of being stressed and fearful in a state of threat, and nobody making that baby or that child feel comfortable and safe again. Because human beings, we can cope with a great deal, which is why we have survived as a race against all the odds. When we lived outside amongst huge dinosaurs, maybe nobody would have put a bet on the human race surviving. But we have, because we work together and we developed really intelligent brains as we went along. But that isn't the thing that will necessarily save us the most. It is this access to the body. So in terms of trauma, even something like growing up in a household where the adults around the child are distracted all of the time. So emotionally, they are not present for the child. So when the child is very sad or very scared or even very happy and excited, the adult doesn't connect with that level of emotion. So the child keeps getting the message all the time that they are not seen and they don't matter as a human being. And also they stay full of all these emotions that they can't process and they cannot manage on their own. So that could be a household just where everything is in place, nice home, nice car, maybe they go on vacation, they have plenty of food, opportunities in life. But what the child isn't getting is adults who offer that physical calming and attunement and the emotional connection and interest and helping the child unpack the feelings that they have. Because again, children cannot do this stuff on their own. So even that kind of childhood we know now can cause this high level of anxiety and stress all the time for a child, which, if it's ongoing, will present as a level of trauma as they get older and will appear in their behavior. So what we know about their behavior is sometimes this trauma goes in and we don't see it. So they might be the very still, quiet child who maybe sits in a classroom or at home, doesn't really bother anyone, keeps themselves to themselves, keeps out of the way. Or it's more likely that we will notice them because they're the child who's running around the mall, pushing things over, shouting, having lots and lots of meltdowns, or maybe harming other children or pets. So those are both ways that trauma can show up. And you can imagine that it is the very quiet, withdrawn, still, shut down version of this, which actually gets overlooked far, far more. And that's a real problem. I know many adults who were abused, particularly sexually abused as children, and they presented in the world every day as the very still, quiet, super, super well-behaved child who, you know, they were just hoping that somebody would notice their physical presentation, maybe very tense and tight in the body, and you know, really quite small in the space that they present in the world, but not bothering anybody, not shouting out, not drawing attention to themselves in any way. So we must, as the adults in the lives of these children, and also, you know, if you work with adults, you must see that also as something to be curious about. Possibly there's an underlying level of trauma there. Now, it's really hard to measure trauma. I used to think, you know, if I knew everything about a case that I was working with, then I would understand the level of trauma that adult I was working with or child or young person had. But I was wrong. I was wrong because it doesn't work like that, essentially. So some of you may know the article that I wrote for Social Work Helper called about how children just don't get over trauma. And the reason that I wrote that is that there is this misunderstanding that, oh, you know, it happened a long time ago. It happened when they were 2 and now they're 8. So we can't keep using the excuse that, you know, there was, they live with a parent who had substance dependency because, you know, then it was all okay, or then they've been adopted, or they've been with their grandma ever since. And there was this complete misunderstanding that children didn't remember what had happened to them and that they didn't absorb it into their little beings and that they would just forget. And in a way, that was a hopeful message. But because we can scan live brains now and we can look inside to see what having a lot of fear and anxiety and possible threat does to a developing brain, we know that what happens before a child is born, and particularly in the first 3 years of life, has the most profound effect on them. And whilst they may not be able to recall the scary person who kept running in their room and hitting them, their body won't forget that every time they are somewhere and a door suddenly opens, their body will react in the same way forever, in fact. The good news is that we can learn ways to create more safety in our whole being, but that memory, even though they can't remember it like we can, I can describe my room to you now, I can describe when I went down earlier on and made a cup of tea, and as I'm talking about it, I can see myself doing all those things. The memories of what happens early on are stored inside of us as what's known as an implicit memory, IMPLICIT. So we don't forget, the body does not forget what has happened to it. So it's really also important to think about medical trauma. So what I mean by that is that, you know, to save obviously their lives, some babies go through a lot of medical trauma, or young children really early on in their lives. They might have to have cannulas put in their arms, they might have to be held down for certain procedures, or maybe their heads have to be immobilized in some way. So that obviously creates a huge sense of fear because they can't understand what's going on. But again, the memory, you know, somebody later on at 10 may just do that to their head for whatever reason, and their whole system will go back to being that 6-month-old baby that had its head held down and felt terrified and was in a heightened state of fear. And your system and your body system can't work out, oh, but now I'm 10 and this is just my friend mucking about holding my head. It will immediately react to help the whole body system survive, whatever that looks like. So this has significant, the memories of all of this. We should not be in that state of minimizing what's happened to children. And likewise, we should not over dramatize what's happened to children, because with the right support, they do have, as do we as adults, it's harder with adults, it takes longer, but we have this capacity to get to a place of wellness and to get resources where we can actually address and cope far, far better with the trauma that lies within us. But we need resources, you know, we can't just expect it to go away or use our intelligent, rational brain to sometimes give ourselves a hard time. Or like I said, you know, with children, we often think, oh, they should be fine now because they know, you know, I was a foster carer, and there's that thing of, but they know I'm a good person. I have never hurt them. They know I'm the kind worker that comes and helps them. Well, yes, maybe over time they can begin to believe that the adult around them is safe, but their body system will still stay on high alert, because what it has done with the survival part of our brain is keep this alive. So it wouldn't make survival sense to just say, oh, this woman, this Jane, she seems so nice. Yeah, I'll just completely let all my defenses down and, you know, come out of hypervigilance and just, yeah, she's just got a nice smiley face. That won't happen. That won't happen whether you're an adult who's survived trauma or a child, because it just doesn't make sense to your whole being. That's not what has kept you alive this far. Maybe being on high alert, watching every time the door opens or checking the door 1,000 times has kept you safe. But obviously that's a really, really, really exhausting, hard way to go through life, because it means that, you know, if you're trying to learn anything or be very sociable and get on with other people, having to check the door every 2 minutes and be distracted by the door and sounds outside the door doesn't lend well to being a very sociable, present, grounded person who can speak in a really articulate way, who can think things through clearly. You can see where I'm going with all of this. So really important to have this broad understanding of what trauma is, and to know that we don't have to always nail down and know exactly what's happened to us, to the child we're working with or the adult that we're working with. It's not about, oh, now I know, that this happened to them when they were 6, so now I really get this human being. It's just about being in that state of curiosity, and most importantly, keeping ourselves as the practitioners and professionals in their lives very, very grounded and calm, and in a really good physical energy state and emotional energy state around the people we come to help. Now, this has been the biggest journey for me as somebody who's worked with families for 24 years. I definitely was not always this practitioner. I was probably more the practitioner that was rushing from one job to another and, thinking, oh gosh, I'll just about make it in time, banging on the door, coming in the door, maybe with this really high energy and all the stuff that I was dragging with me from the previous appointments or meetings I'd had that day. And I went into these people's homes only ever, as all of you do, to do the best I could to help them. But of course, I'm sure a lot of the time I was in this high state of agitation. And of course, that's exactly the energy that I then brought into their space, which was full of trauma. So it was a bit like, shooting electricity into the environment and into the other human being around me. Whereas it would have been really good as I just got out of the car to just take a moment, ground myself, literally just a few moments to do some breathing, maybe use my hands to connect back to myself and my body and down regulate myself. Any of these sort of exercises, if your body likes them, because every person's body has different things that it likes. So it's always to be careful when we try out new stuff ourselves. And then walk up to the front door. Goodness me, would I have taken a whole different Jane through the door? I reckon a lot of the time I was probably fighting against myself in order to be as useful to the human being I was working with. And that's not good. It's not good. And it's also really been a big part of my journey to recognize with all the professionals that I work with, but again, also myself, that many of us, the reason that we come to this work of being the carers, being the people who want to give better outcomes for all those we work with, is because of our own trauma. We have had experiences as children which make us want to just give other people different outcomes. And that's often something that we don't necessarily recognize in ourselves. We're just drawn towards being nurses or to work in preschool or to be teachers or social workers. There's a real drive in us because these are vocations. These aren't just regular jobs, as you all know. And that's the most amazing thing. But it is really important that we have our own journey of understanding what trauma may have occurred in our lives, or high anxiety, being raised by parents who are highly anxious, which is very, very common nowadays, particularly. But also when I was a child, my parents they did a good job, but highly, highly anxious people. So very reactive to everything that we were doing. Then, once we begin to be curious about, what is my journey to this? How reactive or underreactive am I in my personal life or my professional life? Do I need to do something about this? What am I doing to prepare myself before I pick up the phone to speak to somebody? What am I doing to be emotionally really completely present with this child I'm with? If I am even a little bit irritated because they keep knocking the paint pot over, or I bought all these wonderful activities for them to do and they just don't want to do it, and they're just jumping on and off the chair every 2 minutes, and I've had a really rough day, and maybe they do have ADHD or something, that kind of thing that we can sometimes take into our work. or, you know, this client is late again. Oh my goodness, we went through all of this last week. We agreed, they really said they would be here. Don't they know how busy I am and how lucky they are that they have me? And, you know, all those things, none of us are made of concrete. They can be running inside of us. And that, of course, is what the child or the client will connect with, this uncomfortable, stressy energy in us. And that's the last thing they need, quite frankly. They need us to present, not perfectly, because we're not perfect, that's okay, but they need us to present as safety. So that because we have taken a moment to just breathe into ourselves, settle ourselves down, check how we're feeling. You know, I'm seeing this new client today. I've heard a lot of stuff about them. It's making me feel a bit anxious or scared or whatever it is. So just acknowledging that for 1 second yourself, and you know, that's fine. We all feel feelings. It's not a bad thing. But then getting into this state of, but I am just here to serve them and I bring them my love and respect, that just settles us down, and it takes a completely different energy into any interactions that we have with other human beings. And, you know, if you take nothing else away from this today, I would urge you to start thinking about that. So what do people who have lived with extensive trauma need from us? So first of all, they need us to be that regulated, safe person. Now, will they necessarily recognize that straight away? Well, no, they may not, because if you have lived your life around people who are very agitated, very unpredictable, and full of trauma, actually, when you get near the calm, safe people, it doesn't feel very familiar. So what can certainly happen, particularly with children and young people, is that, but also adults, I have to say, I've had this experience, they may kind of, they try to get our energy to match their energy. So children that I fostered sometimes, you know, they would work really hard subconsciously to get me into that state of annoyance with them. So again, as practitioners, it's knowing that that's what's going on and being able to, even within a session, recognize that. And, you know, you can say, I just need to take a deep breath a minute, just, and when you do that, you will bring your client down with you as well. And particularly children, they are very, very sensitive to our body energy. As to inviting them to breathe or maybe learn some techniques, even something as simple as putting your hands on the crown of your head and a bit of pressure and taking a deep breath can be super useful. But if you remember what I said at the beginning about how our body stores memories of everything that's happened to it, so it's always sharing any techniques that you develop with real care, going very slowly with people so that they have time, you know, when they lay their hands, even a hand on the chest. So for me, that feels very comforting. But for another person, depending on what's happened to them, you know, maybe when they were a baby and they were being born, they got very squashed coming out of the womb and their chest got really compressed and they couldn't breathe properly. So as soon as that happens, it may trigger that memory. So it's just doing it slowly and allowing them to connect with whether that feels good or not so good. And that will be a real challenge, because one of the main things that happens when we do have a lot of trauma is, as a way of saving us from that sense of overwhelm all the time, we, nature, which is an amazing and wonderful thing, takes us out of our body. So there's this added kind of complication to it all that most of us anyway, because life is stressful, we live very much out there, you know, looking at what's going on out there, being concerned about, well, will the door open? Well, when is the door open? You know, just running plots. Oh, I have to get to see that client by 3 o'clock, or will the traffic be bad? Should I go now? Should I, so we're constantly, especially if we are anxious people or have people with trauma, thinking about the next bit, the what ifs, which means that we spend a lot of time living in our heads. And we don't really have any connection with our bodies. And particularly if beforehand the body has been a place where trauma has happened, so particularly thinking of sexual abuse or lots of physical abuse, we keep away from it and we keep out of it. So slowly and carefully beginning to build a relationship with the body where actually we can turn to it as a way of bringing calmness and regulation and a sense of safety is really important. But as I said before, it needs to be done slowly and with care. But as practitioners, getting to know, just something like rocking on your feet intentionally or from side to side. Many of us do when we're talking, we rock from side to side. It can change a huge amount about how we show up for other people. So it's really, really important to engage with the body, but in this very careful way. And knowing that everyone who has trauma is triggered by different things in the environment. So again, that 4-year-old child who's now living somewhere really, really safely, or they're maybe in a school and they're 7 and they've gone to the same school for 3 years. And then suddenly one day in school, there's a smell of, I'm trying to think what, some kind of food. Food is very powerful. And the child walks into school that day and they smell the smell of the food. And that was a food that was served repeatedly when they were a tiny baby, maybe strapped in their buggy. And that's when the domestic violence was always happening. So what will happen is the smell will go in. Our nasal system is right next to our alarm and emotion center in the brain, and it will immediately trigger a memory of being that baby trapped while all terrible things were happening around it. So the same thing can happen with a sound, a sight, a touch we've talked about a lot, or a taste. So all of our senses and the whole of our body are taking in information all of the time from the environment. So with trauma, that's, we often have a heightened sense of what's going on around us, because it is that thing of being on high alert all the time. And you might notice it yourself. A good kind of check-in for you if you are working with a lot of trauma is, do sounds that normally I don't mind, am I really struggling now? Have I stopped listening to the music in my car? That perfume or that cologne that I really, really loved, I suddenly now I can't stand the smell of it. It's really too strong. Do I just really want everything to be very still and quiet, and I just want to be in a room where there's not too much stimulation? Do I just want to stay in bed all the time? All those are signs that maybe we are getting overwhelmed. And likewise, with children who can't recognize any of this and they can't explain it to us, it's really, really important to think, if we are caring for any children, because we will maybe never know if they've had trauma or not, to look for those signs, look at their bodies. How stressed and tight do their bodies look? When you're working with children, that's your first thing to look for, is how are their bodies? Again, if they're very, very, very floppy and they're just really not moving very much, and in babies, if they are sleeping for hours and hours and hours, more than babies should sleep, that's a way that nature copes with trauma. Or being very tight and tense and moving quite a jerky way. Or even some young children, you will see them walking very much on their toes a lot of the time and rushing about. So those can be really big indications that something is not quite right for this child. And that can be a really, really helpful guide for you. And again, you know, same thing you will see with adults. If you're working one-to-one with adults, they arrive, they burst into your room, they're sitting there, maybe, you know, their leg is jiggling, or they're just fiddling with their hair all the time, or something, something fiddling, you know, rhythm particularly we use to soothe ourselves with. So those are big indications, but not that we hit the panic button, but that we start to be in that place of curiosity. And we may or may not talk to somebody about trauma, but if we start recognizing ourselves, oh, this is a person who is presenting all the time as overwhelmed. You know, I've done a lot of work with parents, particularly parents with a great deal of trauma, and their capacity to engage in the work is really limited because they get overwhelmed all the time. And I wish, I mean, I do it now, but I didn't used to, that I had always started all my sessions with, okay, let's just take a deep breath. Let's just get ourselves settled in our chairs, using your chair to ground your body into a place of safety, that kind of thing, without going into it in a big way. I'm sure many of my sessions in the old days would have gone as well as the ones do now. So the thing with trauma is to not try to solve it. We don't have to know what it is. And actually your best guide is to, you can feel it through your body, to be honest. The more that you become trauma aware, you can just sense it when you're around people. Look for the physical presentations in the face. What you'll often see is a very tight, quite flat face, or a super, super, super loose, quite, yeah, sort of jowly, loose face. Those are both presentations of trauma. Being very overreactive to things that are said. You know, you've barely finished your sentence and the person has jumped down your throat. Or super underreactive, and you just, you know, children who just don't really engage very much with the play. They maybe just sit with something really simple, just rolling it backwards and forwards. They're not particularly excited about anything. The same with adults. I've worked with adults where you do sessions and you get virtually nothing, and young people as well, really, really very little back, so very low. So those are both presentations to look for. And if we are in that place of down regulation and we have managed to really ground our own bodies and our own beings, then the thing that happens, which is really amazing and really, really useful for people and children, adults and children who have trauma, is we just are more able to trust our instincts about what they need. So that's why a great deal of the work that I do now is about focusing on the wellness of the helpers, the wellness of the carers, and the regulation of their body and their emotional state, because otherwise it's really easy to miss clues, miss information that's coming from the people that we work with, and miss opportunities to give them skills, give them tools, and to catch the unspoken parts of what they're telling us. So some of the people I've worked with in the past, they talk really, really, really fast, and everything's at catastrophe level. And, you know, it's really, really hard in the middle of that sort of waterfall of words and emotions to just actually get behind what is going on for this person and what do they need, because we get into a state of overwhelm. So knowing that, and knowing that even within a session, you can just check in with yourself and bring yourself back to this place of safety, makes you a much more effective person for the people you are trying to help. So I can't emphasize enough that trauma is a really, really common experience in our societies now. It's very unusual to get to the age of 18 years without having had one-off trauma, which many children come through really well, so long as the adults around them do and go at the child's pace and are very emotionally connected and available to them, or ongoing either high or low levels of everyday trauma. So, for example, living in a household where children are regularly spanked or even threatened with being spanked will create that level of tension. So it's knowing that, and knowing that there is so much that can be done. And being trauma aware really means being in a place of curiosity, being very humble yourself, and very prepared to follow the child, and let the child show you. They will be showing you in tiny ways, this is the help that I need. They may be doing things to regulate themselves. So, things that adults find annoying, they might be shouting out, or they might be, tapping something all the time, or rolling something constantly. And we often find those things annoying, but actually that's the child's way of trying to get some down regulation, because our body likes rhythm to help it feel calm. You think of when we pick up a baby, we rock them, we pat them. It's all about the rhythm. So being in that place of curiosity yourself, you're less likely to misjudge or believe that any behavior, whether it's from a child or an adult, comes from bad behavior. It's all communication, and communication of trauma is not often through our words, to be honest. It's much more likely to be through our behavior and also our body energy. So the more, as practitioners, that we become grounded human beings, and we get a much bigger, better relationship with our own gut instincts, then we become even better at the work that we do, which of course has massive benefits for those that we come to serve every day. So my message to all of you would be to do something to get to know how to regulate yourself. Do something that when you're around somebody with trauma, that that it will just be useful, even just to yourself. If you're just slightly swaying, then often for another human being, actually that can be quite regulating. So, and you can have fun with it. If they start looking at you a bit funny, you can just say, well, actually, I'm just helping my body feel calm so that my brain can be really intelligent, and I can really help you, or really listen to what you're saying. So it's good to share this stuff, maybe not to get people to do it, but to show, these are ways that I'm trying to keep really calm and really present for you, so I can do my best for you. And to continue this journey of learning about trauma, there's things that you can study which are really quite simple to just look up. Some of you may have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which first took place in America with nearly 18,000 middle class, predominantly white, college educated Americans, and asked them about their early childhood experiences, and then matched them to their health records, their physical health, their mental health, and their life outcomes, and their coping strategies. So how many people were smoking, drinking excessive alcohol, using prescription, non-prescription drugs, all that kind of thing. And it gives you such a good insight into how these early childhood experiences of not having people who keep a baby and a child feeling emotionally and physically safe play out in us later on as adults, either in our behaviors, our relationships, but really clearly in our health. And I know that throughout the world now, there's a never growing problem with addiction to substances, addiction to food, to shopping, to pornography, to gambling, the list goes on and on and on. And if we track this all back, it will always have come from this place of too much fear, too much overwhelm, too much threat, when our brains and bodies were developing, and then not getting access to the resources and understanding and education and ways to learn to down-regulate our systems. So to leave on a really hopeful note, we can learn ways to help our bodies and therefore our brains feel safer. And we can teach these to those that we come to help every day. It just means getting educated, going very slowly and starting very simply and working out what feels okay for us, and then being in that place of curiosity with those who we come to help.